Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Jonathan Jones. Today, I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about the border war from the Civil War in Missouri and Kansas, and also about some of the impacts on Ray County that occurred during that border war. I am a former resident of Richmond. My wife, Jill Blair, was born and raised there. She taught school there for 20 plus years. I taught for a little while. I coached football and basketball, and then went over to Wentworth just for a couple of years. And then I went into the business world where I've been working as an enterprise architect for an insurance company for about the last 20 years. Um, my stellar coaching career was not the reason I was asked to present today. The reason is that I've just written a book and released it in April, called Moonlit Mayhem, Quantrill's Raid of Olathe, Kansas. Our My family's journey has took us to Chicago for many years. And then we've just recently come back in the last 3 or 4 years, and we eventually bought a house in Olathe. In doing some family research, I learned that my ancestors are directly involved in Quantrill's raid of Olathe during the Civil War. So that's kind of what led me to the topic and to the book, etc. I'm not going to be going deep into the Olathe piece today because you're probably not very interested in that, but it is kind of a tipping point of when things started to change in the border war and get a little more violent, was kind of caused by some things that occurred during the raid of Olathe. So I'm going to touch on some of those things along with some Ray County tidbits that I think you'll find interesting. So a quick commercial before I go, and I'll show this slide at the end too, but the book is called Moonlit Mayhem. You can order it from my website, jonathanjonesauthor.com. If you use the promo code RAYCO, you'll get $5 off a signed copy. I'll touch on this again later, but the book is not specifically about Olathe. It's really about the border war. Olathe is kind of the centerpiece, and the raid of Olathe is kind of the centerpiece. But the book really talks about the border war, what caused it, why did it happen, who were the players, those kind of things. So a lot of the pictures and things you'll see in the presentation today are from the book. So let's get going. So I'm not going to go deep into Bleeding Kansas because there's books and all kinds of stuff written about Bleeding Kansas. But what you need to know about Bleeding Kansas is it was kind of brought on by the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Kansas-Nebraska Act said that Kansas and Nebraska could decide whether they were slave or free state. Back then, slave and free state was kind of like a political party almost, because the government was kind of evenly divided between slave and free state, and neither side wanted to let the other side get ahead because they were afraid that they would take over the government in effect. So it's kind of a industrial nation versus an agricultural nation, and it often is explained as slave and free state, but it's really more the other. It's really more, one side versus the other didn't want the other to take control. The agricultural South and the industrial North. So Bleeding Kansas is a little bit of a misnomer. There's only 55 people died during Bleeding Kansas, and that's from about a 5-year period. It wasn't particularly bloody, to be quite honest with everybody. In the grand scheme of things, certainly what's going to come in the Civil War, it's a drop in the bucket. There were some things that happened in Bleeding Kansas, but if you look at this chart here, the kind of the abolitionist / free state people are in blue, and the pro-slavery kind of Southern people are in butternut. And if you can see, it's kind of a back and forth. It's kind of tit for tat is kind of how it went there. At the beginning, a lot of Missourians and other residents from other states went over and tried to vote in the Kansas elections. And that's what kind of started it all. That's what started the bad blood between, let's just say, Missourians and Kansas, although it wasn't just Missourians, it was from everywhere. But that's what kind of started it all. The pro-slavery group kind of held the advantage early, but by about 1859, the Free State group had kind of taken over and the issue was really settled by 1860, and Kansas was going to be a free state. So back closer to home, what you see on this screen is a map and a drawing of what was called Little Dixie. Little Dixie is just that area you see there, and it was basically that way. It basically frames the river. It frames the river because that's where the fertile farmland was, and that was also the largest concentration of large farms, and thus the need for slavery. So that's an important area because that's kind of where the slaves were. And this next slide shows kind of another depiction of here. This is the density of the slave population during that period. And as you can see, again, it kind of follows the rivers really, because it follows both the Missouri and the Mississippi River, because that's where slaves made more sense, so to speak. Ray County was a slave state, or a heavily slave county. It's not the right way to say that, but it was in that group of counties with many slaves. You can see I found the 1860 Ray County slave census, and this is an example page of that. It's on the internet. Anybody can go look it up. You will. It's an interesting document. You will see probably some names you've heard of before of people who were owning slaves at that point. There were quite a few slaves in Ray County, and in Richmond specifically, had a lot of slaves there. The chart, basically the census here, kind of shows you the name of the slave owner, and then the number slave, the age of the slave, the sex of the slave. It goes into, was the slave blind, deaf, retarded, those different things. It talks about all of those things in this document right here. So here's just a little chart I threw together based on what I found in that census. And it's kind of a manual count. There isn't really a chart anywhere I could find, so I made one myself. But the outlier here is obviously Richmond. You can see there were, according to the census, there were a lot of slaves in Richmond. Also, I looked up the population of Richmond in 1860 as 615, which tells us there were almost twice as many slaves in Richmond than there were non-slaves. It's probably a little misleading because the number of slaves is per the township. So where the township doesn't match the actual city, there's probably a few more slaves outside of the actual city limits of the city, but the numbers are what they are. And you can see the different townships and how many slaves were in those townships. Kind of an interesting chart. So this is another one of the pages, and a couple things I'm going to point out to you here are that if you look to on that left-hand column, the third name down, that it says Ray County, Missouri, and Richmond Township. There was actually 100 slaves owned by Richmond and Ray County between the two of them in this census. So I started counting that and kind of looking at, was there anything to learn there? And what I learned was that a significant number of those slaves were children below the age of 15. So the slaves owned, at least during this census, by Richmond Township and Ray County, were 75% of the slaves were children. So that brings up two questions. One, why did the township own slaves? Two, why were most of them children? I don't have the answers to those, but it's an interesting kind of, I think, little tidbit that I got from this document is those things don't make sense to me. A, I didn't think a government institution would own slaves. B, why were they all so young? And why were they here in Ray County? It's going to take some more research to find the answer to that. But again, an interesting little point to be gleaned from the slave census. David Whitmer, the namesake of this symposium. If you look at the second line on the slave census, there is David Whitmer. He owns one slave. She's 53 years old and a female. To be totally open and honest, there is another David Whitmer that lived in Ray County at the time, a David P. Whitmer. I believe this is David Whitmer. They almost always use first and second initials when almost all of the entries on this census use first and second initials. I don't think David Whitmer had a second initial, so that's why the V is used as the second initial. To be fair, not 100% sure, but that's certainly what it looks like. I also would say that I don't call this out in order to, shame David Whitmer because he owned slaves. I call it out only because if you look on the census, you'll see the names of judges, of sheriffs, of marshals, of treasurers, of attorneys. You will see that the leading members of the community, the majority of them had slaves. Now not all of them had 30 slaves. Those would be the farmers, the large farmers. Just like this one, David Whitmer, the chances of him owning a single, probably female house slave were very good because that was the norm in Richmond at that time. The upper class would have likely had a house slave or two in their household. So then we need to look at what's the situation in Missouri around the time of the Civil War. And I'm gonna go quickly through this because I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. And there's there's volumes written on the history of Missouri, but Missouri is one of the few states, if you look at the flags on the left, Missouri is represented on both flags, both the United States flag and the Confederate flag. Special note, that one below is the Confederate flag. The stars and bars that has kind of generated so much controversy today was never the Confederate flag. That stars and bars was simply a battle flag used by some of the different Confederate regiments. The flag you see on the left, and it went through 2 or 3 kind of alterations and configurations, but the flag on the left is the Confederate flag. Missouri was predominantly Southern leaning at that time. As you can see, the election of 1860 in the chart on the right, Abraham Lincoln just barely got 10% of the vote. Back then, the Democratic Party, which was the I guess you'd call them the pro-slavery party, if you will, had both a northern kind of section and a southern section, and they basically split their votes. And that's what allowed President Lincoln to win that election, because that happened all over the country, not just in Missouri. But as you can see, Stephen Douglas won Missouri very, very closely over John Bell. I don't know who John Bell is, but he was the second place candidate. President Lincoln came in last. In fact, if you go down to like Vernon County in Missouri, President Lincoln got 0 votes in that county. He was not a popular guy. That thinking and that the Republican Party was not popular in Missouri. Missouri was, if you think of how it looks today from a political map, it's kind of the same. The more union leaning folks were in the large cities, and everything else kind of leaned to the southern side. That got a little less dramatic as you move north, moving up around 36 Highway and those things, like, up in that area, those counties started leaning a little more to the north, but certainly the majority of everything, kind of a couple counties north of the Missouri River and then all the way to Arkansas, would have leaned southern. So the Missouri was a southern state, although it stayed in the Union. It voted not to secede, and the governor at the time, Claiborne Fox, approved of that until a couple days after they voted not to secede. Lincoln called for troops from Missouri. I think Fox was basically trying to say, we want to just kind of stay out of it. We don't want much to do with this, so we'll just sit on the side until Lincoln asked for troops. Fox got really mad. Then some troops invaded St. Louis and took an arsenal, and then that tipped him over the edge. So he actually commanded troops in battle, which was the Missouri militia at the very beginning of the war in Carthage, Missouri. And he was the only governor ever to have done that, to have commanded, sitting governor, to have commanded troops in battle. So you had a governor leading the southern portion of the state, and you had the state had not officially seceded. So they were kind of on both flags, just like I said earlier. So very divided place. I mean, we've all heard that, brother versus brother, all that kind of stuff. And absolutely true. Absolutely true in Missouri. The beginning of the war brought on people like the guy you see here, James Lane. He was a Jayhawker. He was joined by Doc Jennison and by Daniel Reed Anthony, all Jayhawkers. Daniel Reed Anthony, by the way, is Susan B. Anthony's brother from Leavenworth. She was the suffragette who had the dollar, Susan B. Anthony dollar. These guys began to create havoc in Missouri. Basically, they were now legal because they could actually raise an army, and were asked to raise armies to be ready for the Civil War, to be ready to defend Kansas, basically, in the Civil War. Jim Lane was a senator and a general at the same time, which is kind of a rare combination. The chart you're looking at now, again, the blue is the Union now, and the butternut is the South, is the South. These are not battles for the most part. These are raids. So this is where a group of men from one side or the other went into a town and executed a raid. Most of these raids were not particularly bloody, although there were definitely deaths in these raids. Most of them were about the plunder, quite frankly. They were about, as you can see, the predominance of the Jayhawker activity at the beginning of the war. It was about punishing Missouri. It was about punishing Missouri for what they had done during Bleeding Kansas. So those Jayhawkers and their men, who were now official Army people, so they kind of had some official standing. They went to all these towns in Missouri and basically burned them and destroyed them and took everything they could that was worth anything. We don't have numbers on deaths for these raids, but what we do know is, if you look at the dates, these raids happened in the winter of 61 and then on into 62. These people were left without homes. It's cold in Missouri. I think everybody knows that. And there was a lot of people that died from exposure because they had no home. They had nowhere to go. They had no food. They had no clothes. The Jayhawkers would go in and they would take all those things. They would take their cattle. They would take their horses. The other thing they would do is free their slaves. President Lincoln had specifically, instructed his army that freeing of the slaves was not something they would do in the early days of the war. And yet they did it anyway, kind of as an official army. So what you see here, and the predominance of what's happening here in Missouri, due to what Jayhawkers have been doing, is what led to the rise of people like William Quantrell and the bushwhacker groups, the guerrilla groups. Quantrell, and let's talk about the guerrilla groups first. They were most of the guerrilla groups started early on as home guard units, because they would get groups of men together who would ride around, and if they heard a group of Jayhawkers was coming over, they would form up and go out and meet those Jayhawkers or harass those Jayhawkers, etc. Quantrell was no different. Quantrell has a whole history, which we don't have time to get into today. He was a school teacher in Stanton, Kansas at one point, and spent most of his early days in Kansas before he came over with a raiding group of Jayhawkers, and then he double-crossed them, and then stayed on the Missouri side and kind of rose to a certain level of notoriety based on some of his actions. What you see here are the top left is kind of what we kind of see him as in all the books and things like that. The other three pictures are pictures that I got from a source that has a lot of Quantrell memorabilia and shows him at a much younger age. interestingly, he was almost white blonde, and nobody seems to know that because the pictures we see, he's not blonde. He's absolutely not blonde, but in reality, he was very fair, very light blonde, and that kind of thing. So the guerrillas themselves that rode with him were mostly very young, literally starting at the age 17, 16, 17. The kids would go ride with Quantrell. They were not poor farmers. You figure they had to be good with a gun, and they had to know how to ride a horse. So, having a plow horse and an old Betsy rifle was not going to get you there if you wanted to be a guerrilla. So they were mostly kind of middle class who were trying to help and protect their neighbors. As time went on, and think back to that last screen, especially during the second year of the war or so, the guerrilla groups really began doing a lot more of harassing of Union troops, stealing mail, breaking up supply trains, supply boats, anything they could do to harass the Union Army. They weren't big enough to do anything else. They certainly couldn't meet the Union Army man to man, because they were small groups who, as the term, they were a guerrilla group. So they would attack and then just dissolve into the woods, and very, very, very frustrating to the Union Army because they couldn't do anything outside the cities, because as soon as they'd go out, as soon as they'd send a supply wagon out, whatever, it would get attacked by various groups of guerrillas, and the supplies would never get there. So that's what really starts the border war, is that kind of that Jayhawker activity, and then the resulting activity kind of from the Missouri Bushwhackers. Who rode with the Bushwhackers? And I'm just going to kind of talk these names really quickly. You've got Bloody Bill Anderson. We're going to talk more about him later. He did not live to the end of the war. You've got George Todd, another one of Quantrell's lieutenants. He did not live till the end of the war. You've got Frank James. Frank did live till the end of the war and actually lived quite a long life. He started with the guerrilla group when he was 17 years old. Everybody talks about Jesse riding with Quantrell as well, and he did for about 2 weeks, kind of on Quantrell's way out of Missouri. He was heading to Kentucky from Missouri. But for the most part, Jesse James was kind of a non-factor in the border war. He really didn't have much to do with the border war. Frank James, of course, would go on to be in the James Younger gang, and he was arrested. He turned himself in and spent very little time in prison, but he did spend a little time in prison and came out to live a long life. John Nolan is, obviously, we don't have a great picture of John, but I guess obviously the point of this picture is to show you that there were African Americans that rode in these guerrilla groups. Whether they were made to, there's opinions all over the place. But John Nolan specifically was very proud of the fact that he rode with the guerrilla groups. He went to all the reunions. There's a chapter on reunions in my book. He was very proud to wear the pin that said he was a Quantrell. He rode with Quantrell. And we have records of a handful of African American men who did ride with Quantrell and other guerrilla groups too. So what kind of tipped everything off was as I said, the Union was getting really tired of losing supplies and losing mail, etc. So up to around March of '62, the guerrillas and the Union Army and the Jayhawkers, they all kind of operated on a kind of a chivalric military code, to where they would trade prisoners, and they didn't execute a lot of prisoners. They would more hold them and trade them for their own prisoners back, etc. That kind of changed on March 13th when General Halleck issued Order Number 2, which basically said anybody riding with a guerrilla group is a criminal and will be executed if caught. When that happened, Quantrell, when he found out about it, he wrote a note back to Halleck and said, "For every one of my men that you execute, I will kill 10 of yours." And we're not going to go deep into it, but that's exactly what he did in the raid of Olathe. He killed 10 men. Next step was later that year, Order Number 19 was issued. Order 19 basically told men in Missouri that you had to pick a side. You either would join the Union Army or the state militia, or you would be arrested as a Southern soldier. So what did this do? What this did was push a whole bunch of people to begin riding with the guerrilla groups. Quantrell's group specifically, had averaged at about 70 men, was now up to over 300 men. And it's not 300 that they're all together and they're in this big camp with tent after tent. That's not how the guerrilla groups work. They all operated in very small groups, and then word would be sent out to come together, and they would come together as needed. They never gathered together, unless they needed to gather together. And it was a system that made them very difficult to catch because they were all over the place. So on July 28th of 62, Perry Hoy was executed. He was the first of, at least of Quantrell's men, to be executed under Order Number 2. That really tipped the wagon, and that's what led to the raid of Olathe, eventually to the raid of Lawrence, etc. So that kind of pushed the Missouri bushwhackers over the edge, for lack of a better way to put it. Raid of Lawrence, again, I'm going to go deep into this. 180 men were killed, men and boys. No women were killed. The thought is that Quantrell was kind of losing control of his men at that point, and Bloody Bill Anderson and George Todd. This is really the first time that widespread murder happened. In the other raids, it was a lot of damage, a lot of burned buildings, but very few murders. Olathe had only 4 actually killed in Olathe during the Olathe raid. This one was an outlier. It was strange because it was on a scale that certainly the border war had never seen before. The raid on Lawrence led the Union Army to issue Order Number 11, and this is a really important part of history that I think a lot of people don't know. But Order Number 11 basically said that the 3 counties south of Kansas City, including Jackson, Cass, and Bates, and a little bit of Vernon, you couldn't live there. Basically, if you owned a farm there, tough, you had to go. As you can see the map, you either had to leave entirely, or you could go to one of the military stations that are shown by the star. If you weren't a Union sympathizer, you couldn't get into the military stations. So you would have to go. And they literally forced people to go. And they chose Doc Jennison to come in and help them go. Kind of a fox in the hen house thing. Horrible event. As you can, Thomas Goodrich said, the harshest act of the U.S. government against its own people in American history. It created thousands of deaths. Just a crazy thing. As you can see at the bottom, all those refugees streaming out of those 3 and 4 counties had to go somewhere. So they went to Lafayette County, they went to Johnson County, they went to Clay County, they went to Ray County. These people oftentimes had no money, had no food, had no clothes other than those on their backs. It was a refugee crisis. Eventually, Ray and Clay County closed their borders to refugees. They literally put guards on the borders to make sure that those refugees didn't come, because they couldn't handle them. They didn't have any way to take care of them. So they basically just pushed them off somewhere else. Really a horrible event. Famous painting by George Caleb Bingham from Kansas City, who was a staunch Union man, but he kind of vowed to make General Ewing, who did this, pay, because he thought it was just way over the top as far as an edict to be placed on the people. This is from the Oskaloosa Independent. At that time, the border counties of Missouri had become almost as desolate in appearance as before the soil was trod by the white man. Not a man, woman, or child is to be seen in the country to which Order Number 11 applies. Chimneys mark the spots where once stood costly farmhouses. Cattle and hogs are fast destroying large fields of corn. Prairie fires are burning up miles of good fencing every day or two, and turn which way you will, everything denotes a state of utter desolation and ruin. Remember, a lot of these families, the men were gone. These were women, children, and kind of injured, if you will. So they had to get whatever they could. They had about 2 weeks to get out. They had to get everything they could and get out. A lot of their horses had been stolen already by the Jayhawkers. So a lot of times they fashioned hand carts from doors and any wheels they could find so they could at least load some things on something to take it with them. Bodies littered the roads that were leading out of those counties because they couldn't handle the travel, or they were already there from past bushwhacker or Jayhawker raids. So that brings us a little bit back to Ray County. Ray County did provide many soldiers to the Civil War. Some of those soldiers, so initially, most of the soldiers went to the Confederate Army. Richmond was a strongly Southern town for the most part, and a slave-holding town, or Ray County was that. James L. Ferris Sr., the guy on the right, whose son would eventually own the Ferris Theater, was a captain in the Confederate Army. Very few went to the Union Army at the outset of the war. That changed when you think about Order 19, which we've talked about before, basically told everybody you had to join. So there were men in Richmond and in Ray County who were tasked with setting up armies and forcing conscription on the men who were left in Ray County. David P. Whitmer was one of those men. James Black, Clayton Tiflin were also enrolling officers in Ray County. It was their job to ride around the county and find people that were not enrolled and enroll them. So the numbers are a little skewed by how many went to which side, because the Union soldiers were largely forced to join, but join they did. So it is what it is. Ray County also contributed a large number of colored troops to the U.S. Army the next year in the fall of 63. So a lot of soldiers fighting in the war. And there's, if you look at the history of Ray County, there's a document called The History of Ray County. It kind of goes through where they served, who they served with. Not all of them, we know their stories, but there are stories in there that you can see. There's about 3 or 4 events during the Civil War in Ray County. This one I just found interesting. There's a man named Benjamin Franklin McHouston, I think is how you say that, and he owned a farm just northwest of Millville. He had sons and sons-in-laws and nephews and all that kind of stuff. And when the war broke out, most of his kin joined the Confederate Army, almost all of them, except for one son-in-law, Lafayette Brandstetter. He joined the Union Army. So the guess is that was not a popular move for Benjamin and his immediate family. After the war, all those people, most of those people came back. A couple nephews didn't come back, but Brandstetter did come back. He didn't die till 1903. He's said to be a very upstanding citizen. He was a justice of the peace. But on his obituary, it talks about all the things he'd done, his kids, those kind of things. Doesn't mention at all about the fact that he served in the Union Army. And the story goes that the family was embarrassed that he fought in the Union Army because none of the others did. So the stigma, I guess, of which side you chose, depending on where you live, continued well into the 1900s. And honestly, it's kind of come back today as that, but it went well into the 1900s. McVeigh's fight is, you can see where that happened. I think it's like 7 miles northwest of Knoxville. Basically, that was a fight between recruits, M.L. James and John Bagby's recruits. Not a lot of information about the fight. I think it was just a really brief skirmish. We don't have a lot of numbers of casualties or anything like that. There probably were none. It was probably kind of just we happened to see each other, so let's trade some shots, but that was about all that happened there. Battle of Albany is the kind of a more famous battle, and that's where Bloody Bill Anderson died. There is a marker at that point today, and you can see where in the map, it shows where that marker is. It's tough to find. It's up a hill behind some trees. You really have to want to find it. Basically, in that battle, the Union kind of tricked Bloody Bill Anderson to come charging at him by putting a force out front of far fewer men and then hiding the rest of them in the trees. Bloody Bill came out with his men screaming a rebel yell, and he went down. There's stories about how he went down. One of them is that he had already made it through the Union lines, and went back to help somebody. And another is just that he was shot in the first volley and went down. So that is where Bloody Bill Anderson died in 1864. And here is that photo that was taken of Bloody Bill in Richmond, assuming it's the day of or the day after his death. He was buried in the Pioneer Cemetery without a marker, with very little fanfare, even though the Union report says that they buried him respectfully and all those kind of things. The story is his body was dragged through town behind a horse. He was a very famous guerrilla. Again, realize that you've got Richmond, a strong southern town. A lot of the papers that are describing this tale are from the big cities. So it's an interesting, who drug him through the town, right? Was it the people of Richmond, or was it the Union Army who were, fighting against him? And there's some questions there to say, was Richmond really proud? And you'll kind of see what I mean when we talk about his funeral in a second. So Bloody Bill never really got a funeral until 1908, when Cole Younger came to town with his Wild Wild West show. And you can see kind of the flyer for one of his Wild Wild West shows. I don't think Frank James was in the one that came to Richmond. Cole Younger, of course, rode with Quantrell during the war, and then rode with the James Younger gang and spent a considerable amount of time in prison. By 1908, he was out and working with carnivals, basically in this Wild Wild West show. He was in town and heard that Bloody Bill never had a full funeral, and he decided he was going to fix that. And he got some people together and gave him a funeral. So the story is that, the story is that more than half the town marched down Thornton Street with two bands playing kind of soft music as they marched towards Pioneer Cemetery. As you can see, where Bloody Bill is buried right on that corner on the south, what would that be? The southwest corner of the cemetery. Supposedly James L. Ferris Jr., this is a picture you see below the tombstone, delivered a eulogy. Cole Younger delivered a eulogy, and J.E. Dunn delivered a eulogy. It was a very proper funeral. It's also said that Cole Younger went kind of really deep into the evil Yankees and how they killed him and all that. And the one article that I read says that, since there was only a dozen Union supporters in Richmond, that speech went over quite well. So again, it's which side are you listening to? Because I imagine if we heard this same tale from a more Union-oriented paper, it might look a little bit different, but that's what the local news said. So that kind of wraps up my program today. Couple things that I do that you might be interested in, at jonathanjonesauthor.com. I do a blog which basically goes through different sites. As you can see on the left there, they're very short. They're not long. They're about 500 words usually, and they go through kind of a border war topic. And I kind of go to a lot. I take a lot of pictures, and then I present them in the blog. It's kind of interesting. I also write a monthly article for the Johnson County Gazette. I have a history column in that paper. So circling back to the book, hopefully I've piqued some interest to maybe drive some people out to buy the book. Again, use the it's all color. All the maps and everything are color. There's photos in there. There's tons of pictures, maps, graphs, etc. Use the promo code Ray County, and you'll get $5 off that signed copy. Much rather you buy it from there as opposed to Amazon, where I get a couple cents when they sell a book, but I do a little better when you buy it from my website. So any purchases are appreciated, though. I hope it's a very, very interesting story, the border war, and I think you'll be glad. If you're interested, please get the book and take a look. So I think now we're going to have some time for Q&A.